Hello, Jessica Frost-Ballas here with the next installment of the Interactive Cards by Jess series for Simon Says Stamp. Today I'm sharing a fun underwater pivot pop-up card featuring stamps and dies from Fawn. I'm beginning to realize that these interactive videos will be a little bit longer than my usual videos, so grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and let's get started. I'm using stamps from DUH-NUH, Fantastic Friends, Mermaid for You, and You Are Sublime from the newest 2018 summer release. To start, I have some of the stamps arranged on the lid of my MISTI. I take a scored and folded A2 card base and fold it backwards. Then I place it in the bottom right corner of my MISTI so what will become the bottom inner panel of my card is facing right. If that doesn't make sense right now, it will as soon as I continue stamping. I ink the stamps with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink, which is Copic friendly. Then I open the panel and place it back inside the MISTI so that what will be the top inner panel is now in the top right corner of my MISTI. I remove the stamps I just used and then ink the other stamps with Intense Black ink. Then I use my mini MISTI to stamp a bunch of other images that I will be using on my card. You can see fish from Fantastic Friends, a mermaid from Mermaid for You, and the deep sea fish and diver from You Are Sublime. I was testing the placement of my stamps earlier, which is why they're already lined up in the MISTI. However, you could easily stamp them one panel at a time in your MISTI or with an acrylic block. Finally, I take the two angel fish from Fantastic Friends and place them on an acrylic block. I wanted a small school of these fish, so I stamped them individually on the bottom half of my card base. Two of the images didn't stamp cleanly, so I took a 0.2 Copic multiliner and completed the lines. I want to use ink blending to create the background of my scene, so I have to find a way to mask all of my stamped images. I could fussy cut post-it or masking paper masks for each image, but I decided to use my Molotow masking fluid pen instead. Masking fluid is similar to rubber cement. Once dried, it will protect whatever it's covering. And once the background is complete, the masking fluid can be easily rubbed off with a finger or eraser to expose the stamped image underneath. You could color all the images and then mask them, but I prefer to start with masking just in case something goes wrong. I won't have wasted all the time coloring first. After I cover all the stamped images with masking fluid, I set it aside to dry while I color my other images. You'll know when the masking fluid is completely dry because it will be slightly tacky to the touch, but none of the fluid will come off on your finger. It also dulls as it dries. Generally, I allow about 30 minutes for the masking fluid to dry completely. Now it's coloring time. I sped up this part mainly because this is an interactive feature and not a coloring video. I will include a list of all the markers I used for each image in the accompanying blog post if you'd like color suggestions for those images. As you can see, I go against the norm and I start coloring with my darkest marker first. I add the darkest color to the parts of the image that would be shaded or furthest away from you. Then I gradually add lighter shades to the parts that would reflect light or be closest to you. If the image gets too light, I'll go back in with the darker shades to add more depth. I'm no coloring expert, but that general rule seems to work for me. Once I was finished coloring, the masking fluid was dry and I was able to start my ink blending. Starting from the bottom of my card panel, I blend Blueprint Sketch, Mermaid Lagoon, Salty Ocean, and Peacock Feathers Distress Oxide ink onto the panel with a round blending tool. Once I finish a new color, I'll go back with the previous color to blend the two seamlessly. I also add a touch of Black Soot Distress Oxide ink to the bottom of the card to give it the feel of deep ocean depths. While I have my Oxide inks out, I also blend an A2 panel with my two middle shades, Mermaid Lagoon on the ends and Salty Ocean in the middle. I will die cut the pivot pop-up panels from this A2 piece later. Next, I use a spritz bottle to spray and splatter water across both panels. I blot off the excess water with a paper towel and then dry the panels with my heat gun to set the Oxide inks. Then I rub off the masking fluid with my finger. You could use an eraser to do this, but I feel like I have more control using my finger. Sometimes an eraser will accidentally drag the Oxide ink over the image if you're not careful. It takes a little time, but it's totally worth it. I use a dry paintbrush to sweep off any masking fluid remains. Then it's time to color the images that were masked. I follow the same shading rules for these images, and again I'll include the exact markers for each image on the Simon Says Stamp blog. After everything is colored, I use purple tape to hold the coordinating dies over the images and then die cut everything. Next, I die cut the pivot pop-up panels from my extra ink blended panel. I die cut it from the bottom of the panel and then turn the die around and die cut it from the top of the panel so that the bottom of each panel will be Mermaid Lagoon and the top will be Salty Ocean. Next, it's time to die cut the pivot mechanism. I love how thoughtfully Kelly Marie from Lawn Fawn has designed this die with lots of score lines and guide marks to help you. I die cut mine with Lawn Fawn Blue Jay cardstock. To set up the pivot, I start by folding it away from me along the longest score line. I use a bone folder to get nice sharp creases. Then I fold it towards me along the two X-shaped score lines, again using my bone folder to get a good crease. Finally, I open up the mechanism and slowly and carefully pinch the longest side of the mechanism between my index finger and thumb while also bringing my hands towards each other. If you've scored the cardstock well, it should fold up easily into an arrow shape. At this point, I go over the creases again with my bone folder. Next, I line up my card panel on my grid mat and use purple tape to temporarily hold it in place while I line up the pivot mechanism inside. While the mechanism is folded up, I add score tape to the top triangles on both sides. I peel the adhesive backing off the top triangle and carefully align the mechanism over my card panel. There's a circle in the middle of the pivot mechanism that allows you to see the score lines on the card panel. Plus, I've lined up the score line on my grid mat so it's even easier to see the lines. Once it's lined up, I press down firmly to adhere the top triangle to the top panel of the card base. Then I fold up the mechanism, remove the adhesive backing from the back triangle, and then fold up the bottom panel of the card base to adhere it to the pivot mechanism. At this point, I open and close the card several times to get the mechanism to move smoothly. Next, it's time to decorate the pivot panels. I die cut the word thanks from silver glitter cardstock using FINLEY'S ABCs from Lawn Fawn. Then I fold the pivot panels. I fold them in the middle towards me and then fold the small flap away from me. I use a bone folder to create a sharp crease. At this point, you can see how the flaps will interlock to create the large panel. I add score tape to each flap and then adhere them together. Next, I use liquid adhesive to adhere the sentiment to the pivot panel. I place an acrylic block over the sentiment to hold the letters in place as they dry and move it out of the way while I work on the next part of the card. I use the Stitch Hillside borders to die cut a small sliver of craft cardstock. Then I add texture and depth to the ocean bottom by adding dots with several brown Copic markers. I adhere that to the bottom of my card and trim off the overlap. Then it's time to start assembling my scene. I'm not always a fan of the white border around die-cut images, so sometimes I will use matching Copic markers to help disguise those borders. I carefully color the white border around each die cut using E43 for sand, B26 for the darker ocean waters, or BGO5 for the lighter ocean waters, and then adhere them to my scene. I also add the mermaid and a few fish to the pivot panel and color around each image. Next, it's time to adhere my pivot panel to the pivot mechanism. There are score lines on each end of the pivot mechanism that show you where to add adhesive. Be careful not to get adhesive anywhere outside of those lines or your pivot won't work correctly. I prefer to use tape adhesive because I can easily rub it off if it gets somewhere it shouldn't be. In the middle of the pivot mechanism, there are two small score lines on the top and bottom that show you where to place the middle of your pivot panel. It's a little tricky to see on colored cardstock, but you can also trace them with a pencil or pen to make them easier to see since they'll be covered by the pivot panel later. After you place the pivot panel, press the adhesive firmly into the panel. Then it's time to fold up your card. The first few times you'll kind of have to guide the mechanism into place, but the more you play with it, the easier it folds back into place. By the time I turn it horizontally to fold it more easily, it's pretty much closing on its own. Now it's time to add some of the finishing touches. I start by adding a little Spectrum Noir clear sparkle to the submarine windows, the mermaid's tail, the diver's tank, oxygen line, and mask. Then I add accents to the images with a white gel pen. I try to add lines and accents where there would be reflected light. Next, I want to add a few floating elements to my pivot pop-up card. I start by coloring around the fish and the diver die cuts with my BGO5 marker. Then I die cut each of those images from Blue Jay cardstock and cut several small strips of acetate. I apply adhesive to the back of the colored images and to the front of the die cut blue cardstock, and then sandwich the acetate strips between the colored image and the die cut cardstock. I find that this holds the acetate in place more securely than just adhering the acetate to the colored images. I apply thin strips of score tape to the acetate strip and then adhere it behind the top of the pivot panel. This gives the appearance of a swimming fish, which I really love. I intended to do the same for the diver, but realized he was so big that he'd stick out from the card, preventing it from fitting into an envelope. So instead, I used clear fishing line. I followed the same process and sandwiched it between the colored image and the blue cardstock die cut. Then I cut 2 small rectangles of blue cardstock and sandwiched the other end of the string between them. I applied adhesive to the rectangle and adhered that to the back of the pivot panel. This allows the diver to swing loosely back and forth, and now the card can close. Finally, I attached my last 2 fish to the bottom of the pivot panel. Because my coloring soaked through my cardstock, I also add an A2 panel of white cardstock behind the bottom of the card base to give it a more finished look. It also gives me a place to write a message. If you don't use markers or have a lighter hand than me, you might not need this step. For the front of the card, I want to give a hint of what's to come on the inside. I stamped the sentiment sending my deepest thanks from You Are Sublime onto an A2 panel of white cardstock with VersaFine and heat emboss it with clear embossing powder. Then I blend the same Oxide inks onto the panel in a diagonal pattern. I add more splatters of water and blot them with a paper towel. I adhere it to the front of the card base and then adhere my little deep sea fish. I add a little Spectrum Noir clear sparkle to the little dangly on his head. Off camera, I also add tonic crystal glaze to the dangly and also to the submarine windows and the diver's mask on the inside of the card. Also, after completing the video, I realized that I forgot to add a few white gel pen accents to the fish on the front of the card, so I did that as well before I mailed it. I love all the elements of this card, from the hint of the front of the card to the full explosion on the inside. Then the little fish on acetate and my diver on string add another little interactive element to the card. Finally, the sparkle and shine from the Spectrum Noir marker and crystal glaze really catch the light and make this card come to life. And that's it! Have you ever tried making a pivot pop-up card? If not, I hope this will inspire you to give it a try. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back next month with a new interactive card. Have a fabulous day, and until next time, happy crafting! Bye!